welcome to Contourcast. My name is Kat Boyd. I'm joined with my wonderful co-host David Jameson.
How's it going? I'm in very good fettle at the moment. Just back from a wee holiday on the Canary Islands.
Well, it was your honeymoon, right?
Was indeed. So I was getting that winter sun thing on the go. Oh, I've never done that before. It was incredible.
I mean, they are 4 words that will make a lot of people hate you. Getting some winter sun.
Yeah, I know. I was going to get some winter gloom, right? I think our first attitude was we were going to go to somewhere like Prague or Berlin, right? But then Omicron happened, and we were like, we were sort of almost kind of like fleeing across the continent away from the disease. But when we were in Canary Islands, it was like, why on earth were we thinking of going somewhere else cold and miserable when we could have been going somewhere that was like 22 degrees?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm fully in support of it. If you can go away from here in the winter, then you should absolutely get out.
I have unhealthy attitudes about how important it is to sun yourself, right? Like, see, when I'm abroad in that, I'm like, I'd sit out on the balcony in the morning getting sunned, and Ruth would be like, are you wearing sun cream? And honestly, I'm sort of like, no, I need all the radiation.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's not, I'm not putting on sun. I'm not excluding.
It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
For Scots to go abroad and sort of roast themselves like a rotisserie chicken.
Yeah. So that was me out there roasting in my own juices.
That's so gross.
And it was great. Like, it was like, I mean, it is how people depict it, right? Do you know what I mean? It was us, and like, I mean, I did like this as well, though. There weren't too many young people there. There were some, right? But there were a lot of oldies. You know, my people, in some senses.
I mean, you know, I love the old as well. I love the elderly.
And you know, they're just, there's no nonsense. There's no parties going on keeping you up late night. There's no.
And did you get any good chats about Brexit?
I dare say I could have. But
I mean, like when I was on my honeymoon, James absolutely spoke to a man in the airport queue about Brexit.
All right. And were they agreeing about how great it is?
Yeah. They were basically like, "Oh, I can see why it's a good idea."
No. But I just, you know, it's just that it's. I find that a better. That kind of older tourist cohort, you're not going to have stuff like people throwing up in the pool. Do you know what I mean?
No.
More dignified behavior.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that about it as well. They're very different from a kind of holiday I'd usually do, but I'd highly recommend it. Thought it was great. Did the whole package thing as well.
Oh, were you all inclusive?
All inclusive. Well, no, we did self catering, but it was like a package deal where you get the flights and the apartment.
Oh, yeah.
You know. It kind of reminded me of that Blur song. They did a song about package holidays.
I don't know. I was never really a Blur fan.
It's that one, Girls Who Like Boys.
I mean, the song Girls and Boys.
Is that what it was called? I can't remember. I think it came out in about like 1994. So
yeah. I got a bit about package holidays in it.
There's a line in it about following the Hards down to Greece. So it's about that. It's about that kind of culture of like package holidays that I suppose was booming then in the early 1990s. That's really when it was coming into its own as a thing. So yeah, but you know, it was great because I'm a snob about stuff like this. I'm one of these people who's like, I need to read a book about where I am, right? Another classic Brits abroad kind of thing that but there's not been a lot of what I would consider cool history in that part of the world, though. I mean, there's quite a lot of stuff has happened. Like it was important in the slave trade and stuff like that. But I did end up reading a novel by a guy who sort of was exiled there, a Portuguese writer called something Saramago, called The Gospel According to Jesus Christ.
Jose Saramago.
Aye.
Yeah, he
So
wrote a book called Blindness, which is one of my favorite books.
Ruth was reading that out there. So instead of reading a history book about the area, we decided we would absorb some of the local culture. He says, this guy, that he had to flee there, right, from Portugal. He didn't really. He just had through the huff because they didn't like his book about Jesus. But
I mean,
anyway.
I have to flee a lot of situations in that in those terms. I'm gonna start using that. Like, I absolutely have to flee this party right now.
I have to flee this party because of my views on Jesus.
I mean, that is fairly likely, to be honest.
But I really enjoyed it, that book. I've not read Blindness yet. I'll give that a read. But he's a gorgeous writer. Do you know, he's one of these guys who, and I love this about reading like a really good novel. His way of writing starts to like infect your brain, and you start thinking your thoughts in his idiom. You know, I really like that when you read someone like that who has a really poetic way with language. So all in all, yeah, absolutely baked in my own juices. As I say, Sun, literature, Brits abroad.
Do you feel different now you're married?
In a way, I mean, me and Ruth had been together for like quite a long time before we got married, and you know, we lived together for years, and so in a way, do you feel different?
Yeah, I suppose I do. I suppose that like James and I didn't live together really for very long before we got married, and like accidentally very trad move. Actually more borne out by the fact that we are both completely neurotic people who need our own space to survive. But yeah, so it's hard to separate out whether it's being married or living together. Do you know what I mean? That's making the difference. But I guess for me, marriage means that like there's a commitment there to like to always work through stuff. Like that there is nothing that is insurmountable, that there is no problem too big for you to get over. There's nothing necessarily unforgivable, and you make that commitment to like work through difficulties, but also to, I don't know, I think that there's a commitment to like celebrate each other's successes and like really have each other's backs. And do you know what I mean, when things get difficult. So I don't know, I feel like it's the sense of lifetime commitment, which makes things different or gives it a different dynamic. Do you know what I mean? It's not that like no one's just going to go, oh fuck this, and walk out and slam the door and then that be that. Do you know what I mean? There's a bond there that you've both kind of like signed up to.
Yeah, and the cynics out there will say, well, we'll revisit that in 20 or 30 years. That bit.
We cat boys on our fourth fucking husband. James Foley dies in mysterious circumstances.
Yeah. But I agree. I think because at least in kind of soap operas and sitcoms, the male fear is always supposed to be the finality of the situation, right? You're abandoning the thing that was supposed to make you a man heretofore, which was your bachelorhood, right? I have to say that's caused me no anxiety at all. If anything, that would sort of arrive as a kind of relief.
Yeah, totally.
I mean,
Although and maybe we could talk a bit about this because we've got a kind of like free floating agenda today. But those statistics about the new bachelorhood that were just released.
Is this a sort of sexless bachelorhood?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so it's fascinating. I've had people.
So let me
Go on,
find
yeah.
the graph. So it was published in the Washington Post, and it was titled, well, no, the poll was called "Young Male Virginity on the Rise. The share of men age under 30 who report zero female sex partners since they turned 18 has risen from 7%, and I mean it's 7% in 1989, but it's pretty much steady with like slight ups and downs until 2008. And then 2008 to 2018, it rockets from 8% to 27%.
It's just incredible.
I mean, I think it is completely incredible, especially when, you know, this is a time, like particularly in the US, where, I mean, I suppose all over the kind of like Anglophone world, that a religion is waning, like, and people's commitment to like religiosity is declining. You know, this isn't coming from, you know, these young men are not all running away and joining the priesthood, or are terrified of having a sexual experience because they might go to hell, or, you know, you don't have sex before like that's not what's happening here.
Yeah.
And we also live in an incredibly permissive society where, you know, sex is seen as something very, I mean, I think that there's a lot of liberalism about it, that, you know, it's not a taboo subject, that you know, sex work is a legitimate form of work, and regardless of what your views are on that, you know, I think that they were not the same views that were dominant in society as in 1989 when those rates were at 8%. So I think that generally speaking, society's views on sex and sexuality have become more open. So for that statistic to then jar up against these things, I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and it's for I mean, for more, maybe things are changing slightly in recent years, and I wonder if this is part of what's driving that figure up. But certainly, for much of the time that you've talked about, you know, from the end of the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was a great fear in the 1990s about raunch culture, right? You remember that phrase? It sounds so quaint now, right? But even into the early 2000s, you had books coming out by feminists called Female Chauvinist Pigs. That was kind of one of the biggest,
I remember that,
popular feminist books of its time. Now seems completely outdated, like completely dated in just a few years. And in that period, in the 90s and early 2000s at least, but to be honest, from what I can see, it's still the case. There's actually a degree of stigma about not having sex. And when we say it's a permissive society, that kind of implies that people are being allowed to have as much sex as they want. It's not even that. It's if you want to be considered a normal person, let alone a cool person, you need to be having sort of promiscuous sex when you're young. That's very much the social pressure, as I understand it. So it's quite remarkable that well over 1 in 4. And was that the figure? What was it?
27%.
27.
I mean, it's an American study.
Yeah.
I would be.
And I think you're right.
And it's from 2018, so it's like.
And by the rate that that's going up in 10 years, you would assume that it was, you know, higher than that now.
Yeah, and I think that it's pretty clear that a lot of American cultural exports become the dominant things in British society. So even though it's an American study, I wouldn't be surprised if a similar pattern was replicated in the United Kingdom.
So that see those 8% who were once sort of men, and this is hang on a minute. Give me the statistic again. 27% haven't had sex before what point in their life?
Under 30.
Under 30.
Like, so basically, men under the age of 30 who report zero female sex partners since they turned 18.
I assume that 8% before this skyrocketing figure were largely a part of a minority current which has always existed in American society and still exists, but is smaller, of people who take their vow to not have sex before marriage very seriously. Like there's a minority evangelical current in American society, you know, this the silver ring movement and stuff, like they take a celibacy ring and stuff. Notoriously, I mean, a lot of those kids are at it, right? Apparently, when they catch one of those kids, they tell them to take the ring off, which is pretty cruel. But anyway, yeah, I mean, it's just such a remarkable development that, and of course, it's not. America's not the first country. Some people call this like Japanization, because Japanese men, young men, have been drifting away from sexual encounters with young women, but also from female company, and ultimately from the company of others, to a huge like extent. There is a whole their scene now is, I think, I can't remember what it is, but there's a Japanese word that sort of describes them as a kind of underclass in Japanese society, of men who refuse to engage in society, refuse to meet women, refuse to get a job, and live with their parents. And this is a huge phenomenon in Japan. And it's partly related, of course, to Japan's long-term economic stagnation. The Japanese economy is bizarre. It's a real mystery. But it has these kind of chronic problems. It's hard for people to enter the labor market and so on. But it's obviously as well part of a much wider phenomenon of kind of alienation from the social life of capitalism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that that is the important takeaway for me from this graph, is that, I mean, it is nothing to do with the fact that, you know, sex is no longer taboo, or you know, that people are more God-fearing. Like none of these things are the reason for that. But it's also not, I mean, the incels aren't right. I think, like, it's important to say, like, they get this obviously quite wrong. It's not, I think that they always like throw out this mad statistic about like how women are having all this sex with particular types of men, but not those men, right? That just isn't borne out. Like, I think that women's sexual experiences remain fairly steady. In fact, like, I remember reading that between 2005 and 2010, that like women were having less sex. And remember, like, these changes are coming round about the periods of the financial crisis. I mean, where people are like pushed into greater precarity, yada yada, right? So I get that may be sort of it may be the same for both sexes, but I think, as you say, the example of what's happening to young men in particular in Japan is very, very telling. And actually, we should be looking at this development or this trend as a sign or a symptom of capitalism, that it's actually it's a sign of serious and quite depraved alienation. Like, this is what this is about. It's like deep alienation. You know, young people like being denied certain normal life experiences, perhaps economically, but there's also something that's happening, I think, where more and more people are living their entire lives online. I'm not really sure that, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I would say it's probably quite alienating, in terms of like what it means to be human. But I think that this is where a lot of the other, like, sort of the other subcultures around sex and gender emerge from. Because if you're having your only sort of like sexual encounters on the internet and you're an avatar, then it doesn't really matter, like, you know, whether you're male or female or whatever. Do you know what I mean? These things don't really matter in that context if you are living out your sex life online. And I think that that's becoming increasingly the option for young people, especially, do you know what I mean, like over the last 2 years, when everyone's been shut inside for so long.
God, yeah. And there's a guy, who I talk about, I'm sure I've talked about him before on here, Mark Leela, who's a really interesting sort of liberal thinker about like the consequences of cultural and social change. And he says there's always the way that modern kind of reactionary thinkers work is that we live in a society which is so rapidly transformative of social norms and cultural codes, and sort of technological interactions with society, that every new deluge sort of leaves behind a new Eden in sort of like in recent history. So modern conservatives many of them are sort of transfixed with the idea that we lived in a dramatically different society in the 1950s. Right? You often hear this, like, oh, let's go back to the 50s when things were okay. Of course, in the 1950s, conservatives thought that they lived in a period of peak degeneracy and so on. And it's also true of liberals who seem to think that, like, the 2012 Olympic ceremony in London was the peak of human civilization or something. We've since gone drastically wrong. In much the same way, you can well imagine, and a lot of kind of culture war debates are now structured like this, people just saying, well, the quote unquote raunch culture of the 90s was the healthy dispensation. And the people who are kind of fapped to bits on the internet are the alienated, like, freaks.
Yeah,
But really, what you have here is two deeply alienated ways of interacting with human sexuality.
totally. No, I totally agree with that. But I think that this type of like reactionary nostalgia, it goes far beyond the culture war as well. And it's not just conservatives that are guilty of it. Um, I saw a really, really grim thing the other day on Twitter. We can add that to the long list of really grim things you've seen on Twitter. But I can't remember, as a journalist had tweeted a poll, and it was in the height of Johnson's, is it a party, is it not a party, all that sort of bit that's been going on. Which I mean, I totally see why people are angry. I just cannot motivate myself to feel anything other than flatline about it. Do you know what I mean? I'm just like, I always feel like these people are taking the piss. Like, all politicians are taking the piss. Anyway, this journalist had tweeted, if you could drop one of the last 4 prime ministers of the United Kingdom into 10 Downing Street today, who would it be? And of course, the options are David Cameron, Theresa May, Gordon Brown, or Tony Blair.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna guess. I didn't see the outcome of the poll. I saw the poll, I didn't see the outcome. I'm gonna guess that the person who won is Gordon Brown.
Oh, spot on.
Because it's now a thing that centrist types, journalists and academics and stuff, like politics adjacent parts of the middle class, have this weird theory now.
Absolutely. Gordon Brown was the man who should have been.
Yeah. The man who should have been king, but we, the foolish people, discarded him for trivial, stupid reasons.
No, we, the people, discarded him for one thing and one thing only, and that was calling Gillian Duffy a bigot.
Yeah.
Like, that's actually, but that's what's out there now, is that because he called that woman a bigot, that's what did him in.
Yeah. No, I mean, he was struggling before that. I mean, he was.
That's why he went to our fucking house. I'm sorry, has no one seen the thick of it? Like, that's literally right, Gordon. You need to get to the coal face.
Wait a minute. Did that coal face episode? So this is the episode where a woman keeps shouting at the minister, "Have you ever had to clean up your own mother's piss?" Right? That came out before the Duffy incident.
Did it?
If it did, that's remarkable. I think we should look that up. But
okay, I'll get on.
I didn't realize that was a commentary on Brown. But no, it's it's pretty funny.
My God, I've just Googled it, right? Like, obviously Gillian Duffy is now Rochdale's most famous pensioner. And it's just like, this is the row that followed all but destroyed Gordon Brown's political career.
Oh God, I don't really think that happened.
Bigot Gate 10 years on.
No, I remember. I mean, I couldn't. I remember someone telling me off for laughing about it hysterically at the time and saying, "Well, you know what means David Cameron's going to get in." But I think I've said this on the podcast before. I couldn't stop laughing at the dismissive, like, tone of his voice once he was back in the car. And the thing that he said about Gillian Duffy, which was my favorite political criticism of people in general, right?
Yeah.
Whatever their political view.
See, the thing is, regardless of whether you agreed with Brown that she was a bigot or agreed with Duffy that she was just expressing legitimate concerns, like whatever, it was the beauty of that moment was like how human Gordon Brown suddenly became. Like this man who had seemed out of touch, who, like, all the stuff about him not being able to smile, suddenly, like, he's literally just left our house, he's in the car and he's already bitching. I'm like, this is real. this is the real bit.
But that's the thing, isn't it? It's like, see, if he didn't go around all the time pretending to be a kind of elder statesman, people would have probably heard that and said, yeah, that's what I'm like. Do you know what I mean? But it was just the way when they were driving away and he goes, first of all, he's trying to blame other people. He's going, who put me with that woman? He's already trying to get someone. One of his poor aides is about to get chewed out. Who put me with that woman? And then you hear an aide say, what did she say? And he goes, oh, everything. I love that. You can hear how, like, worn down his soul is after like 20 years of frontline politics. It's just,
oh my God, it is before the episode of The Thick of It is before
life
Gillian Duffy.
Yeah.
So the episode is, of course, called The Rise of the Nutters.
Yeah.
And it's 2007.
So there you go. But if you remember in that episode of The Thick of It, ultimately they managed to shake the piss woman off by pretending, by claiming that she's a candidate for the BNP. So it's even closer. Do you know what I mean? Like, that is how you disable a random member of the working class electorate. You just say they're racist. Like, that's the way you deal with it.
Satire is officially dead. Like, you couldn't, like, Armando Iannucci couldn't write that now.
Well, like, Armando Iannucci tried and failed to write present politics. Yes. So he, first of all, he said quite correctly he couldn't do The Thick of It anymore. The weird thing about him is, I think in a sense he didn't really understand his own joke, right? Because what he's criticizing in The Thick of It is the character of political centrism, is that kind of late New Labour thing where it's so apparent that no one has any political ideas, everything's being run by wonks and hacks. And so that's the joke, right? Is the hollowness of contemporary politics. What happened in the years after were things like Scottish independence, Corbyn, Brexit, right? And Iannucci, like other members of his class, lost his mind. And part of his response to that situation, by the way, was the extremely good film, The Death of Stalin.
Yeah, so that was genuinely funny.
Yeah, it was very funny. It's very good and it's very dark and stuff as well. But he said, well, he became interested in the subject matter of Stalin because of the rise of figures like Corbyn and Farage, right? And I was like, wait, what are you talking about? Yeah. Two people who could not be less comparable to Stalin, right? So even he, a brilliant writer though he undoubtedly is, really struggled to keep pace with the situation.
This is also like why writers like Chris Morris have sort of gone into other projects, because you just can't do political satire anymore.
Mm.
I mean, I would have said that, David Cameron and the pig, let's not forget, right? When there was that like weird moment where a Black Mirror episode became reality, like I think that satire started to be very difficult for
Yeah,
TV writers.
yeah. Once it kind of meets in the middle, it's
But
difficult.
also, political life is now beyond satire. Would you like me to give you an example of this?
Yeah.
Again, let me open up my bulging file of terrible things I've seen on Twitter. There was someone tweeting about pretty proud of my undergraduate porn studies syllabus.
Oh, I saw this. Go on.
Here's a reading list, a thread, right? So this is a university course in undergraduate porn studies, whatever the fuck that is, right? I assume it's pretty clear what it is,
It's a
right?
joke about students waiting to happen, isn't it? Like,
I know.
Do you remember when people used to say to you things about, oh, you're watching Countdown all day, right?
Yeah.
That's so tame, man.
I remember like, oh, what you doing a degree in drinking?
Oh, yeah. And
Like,
now
well,
it's like, actually,
I mean, technically, yes, right? But
actually, I've wanked my way through 3 years of university. Since you ask, I don't go to the pub because I don't like to meet people in the real world. I've got my porn studies.
It's when it gets to week 6's reading list that you really realize that satire is finished, because there's a there's a one of the compulsory readings is selections from Jones Camming Lee's quote, "Cum guzzling anal nurse whore in feminist porn book."
I just like the whole debate aside about like pornography and sex.
How is that not performance art?
I
But
mean,
it's real.
That reminds me of the time that George Galloway shouted spunk-loving sluts in Parliament. He was afforded that opportunity because someone he was criticising owned the title, alongside several newspapers. He owned. Oh no, it was like a satellite TV show called. There was one called like Asian Babes and another one called Spunk Loving Sluts, and you can still find little clips of George Galloway bellowing that in the House of Commons, except that he was doing it because he's slightly kind of morally puritanical, to reprimand some Tory for owning this TV channel.
Yeah, now spunk loving sluts is like on the curriculum.
And now it's on the progressive curriculum at like a liberal arts college in America. So yeah, no, it's truly bizarre.
I mean, I really do think that, particularly after the pandemic, the fact that everyone is so terminally online is a really bad thing for politics.
Yeah, and I have no idea how you get out of that. I had a lengthy conversation with someone recently who pointed out, like, by the way, see when I saw Mark Zuckerberg mincing about in something called the metaverse, I literally, do you know what? I've actually since realized that I'm actually deploying real, don't know what you would call this, like the psychological thing where I detached from the situation. Like I literally said, I'm not thinking about that, right? I've never read anything about the metaverse. It took me months to ask someone what it is. I'm horrified by it. Like
I saw an article, maybe, I mean, it sounds like a BBC headline. What is the metaverse? In images, like, so I think it probably was like on the BBC website. I did not click on it. I'm not interested in what the metaverse is.
It's over for me, and I just think I don't understand why that isn't literally 100% of people's attitude, right? The whole idea of the metaverse, as I understand it, is that it's going to become like you're going to become even more integrated into the internet. Why is that a good thing? Why would anyone want that? I cannot understand why. And it's also like, oh, it'll give you this kind of like even kind of closer contact to all the sort of content that you like. How much? Honestly, at times it's like you actually feel disgusted by it. It's like, how much fucking content do you people need?
I mean, I don't want any more content.
I mean,
just before like we started doing this pod, I have like marked my Twitter as like I'm on hiatus from the fucking internet. Like honestly, I just need a break from content.
we are 7.5 billion content pigs, right? Content hogs with our mouths constantly attached to the giant teat of the internet, right? Just
Content loving sluts.
content loving sluts. That is, we're just getting pumped full of content, fit to bust. And I just, do you know what I mean? It's like I've already got that thing, right? Like I lost a bit of weight for the wedding. I don't dare to look at the scales now because I've already entered into a kind of week of Christmas. Do you know what I mean? Mince pies, you know, the chocolates and the mulled wine, and I already feel sick. Like like Christmas is already running in my bloodstream as a mix of sort of just syrup. I feel like I'm made of syrup. But that's also how I feel about the internet. I just don't understand how anyone could want to gobble down more of that. It's far too much. We are saturated. I want out. I don't want to go deeper in. I don't want to go deeper down the rabbit hole and see how content obese I can become.
I mean, I see that sensation you're talking about. I wonder if any listeners have experienced the same thing. Because I noticed it earlier that I had been out for most of the day, speaking to normal, like human beings, like face to face. I came back home and then I sat on my phone for about 40 minutes
and just felt all
doom
the joy
scrolling,
drain away.
right? And then I was suddenly like, oh, I feel really sick again. And I didn't connect it straight away, but I've been having these like intermittent bouts of nausea. And I think it's actually, I'm overdosing on content.
Mm.
And like that shit, like it goes for your dopamine. Like you actually get hits from it.
And then it's like anything else, you get withdrawal.
And you need more. You need
Yeah.
more to get the same high. Yeah, I've had enough internet for this year.
Yeah. I mean, I genuinely wouldn't be against a society where the state can step in and say, we're redirecting, you know, investment into other areas. The internet is about as developed as we need it in many of its spheres. We're not going to have a metaverse because no one needs that much content.
What about this as an idea, right? If there was to be like my very benevolent dictatorship, what you would do is you can have internet, unlimited fucking internet. Everybody should be able to have internet, but it switches off at 10 o'clock at night, right? So you just get you remember like the old telly thing that your parents would talk about, like, or like even when we were like teens, BBC Two would switch off for the night and you would just have teletext pages on a rotation.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what it would be. Maybe like the internet would get switched off at 10 o'clock. Right? Everybody's had enough content for the day and there's just some teletext pages instead.
I mean, I know that they're introducing kind of measures a bit like this in China.
Are they? Sorry.
So there you go. You found your motherland. Well, they're giving kids 3 hours a week to play video games online. Well, the thing is, right, and the Chinese state actually say this. I think we may have talked about this. They're saying things like, so they've basically launched a kind of crackdown on like capitalism, right? I mean, albeit that it's the most dynamic center of capitalism in the world today, but they've decided, they've looked at America and said, we're not going to have our kids turn into that, right? So they've restricted video game hours for children, right? So I mean, literally, you have 3 hours, and if you can use them or not, but you get kicked off the internet, right? I don't know how they're doing this. They're also, this is quite grim. They're now monitoring content on the internet, on TV, and elsewhere to sort of uphold masculine values for men. So they are forbidding you from sort of feminizing or they're just trying to discourage you from doing that. This is part of their whole like social credit worldview. It's about how you incentivize, as they see it, good behavior. I mean, it is sinister, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. But this just forms part of. I was reading a really interesting article about this in the Financial Times today. Like apparently, like they're saying, people in the Chinese government are becoming more and more loud in their claims that China is on the rise and America is declining. There was a speech by Xi Jinping where he said this, and that's not uncommon in the speeches of the kind of presidential figure, where he said the West is declining, you know, the East is rising. But this is now being said by Chinese government officials in communications with the US government. So Chinese diplomats go into negotiations with American diplomats and say to them, remember, we're on the rise and you're falling, right? Whereas I don't know if that's a mode of like psychological warfare or something, right?
Probably.
But, and the point that the Financial Times was making is like, well, maybe that's overstated, but, and I think it is, but you'd need to look at America and China today, and I mean in the last week, to see an enormous contrast, just enormous. So in the United States, there's been a few studies come out, I don't know if you've seen this, of quite senior figures in the intelligence scene saying that some kind of civil war is a distinct possibility. Now, you have to ask, is this about fear about, say, the return of Trump, right, and its implications? But some of the kind of academics and stuff who are saying this are saying things which are not too unbelievable, I think, at this point, right? So they're saying it's not going to be a civil war like the last US Civil War, where parts of the country formally secede or anything like that. But what they're saying is, what if things like the mass shooting outrages that are just permanent in American society now morph into a kind of permanent state of violent unrest where various sort of armed militant factions are perpetually committing sort of violent attacks on each other? So that's the kind of fear. The fear is that polarization in the American population, which has exploded since the early 1990s, is going to lead to a kind of permanent state of tit-for-tat violence, distinct, but it would have like some of the patterns of kind of the later stuff that happened, for example, in the Troubles, right, where it kind of increasingly lost the political content and the attacks became this kind of tit-for-tat sort of thing. And at the same time in America, so you have an utterly polarized population, violently polarized increasingly, and you have a ruling party who I think you would have to say the Democrats are now. I mean, I think the capitalists trust the Democrats probably a bit more than the Republicans because of Trump's seizure of the Republican Party, who can't pass their main items of legislation. They can't pass the kind of stimulus packages that American capitalism needs to compete with countries like China. So Joe Manchin, who's a senior figure on the right of the Democratic Party, this week blocked the Build Back Better, which is like a $2 trillion stimulus package, on grounds that remain frankly mysterious. There's a claim made by a few that this is a system in America called the rotating villain, right? Which is that presumably this guy, Joe Manchin, might be on the way out of politics, and business lobbies and various kind of establishment forces in and around American politics, you know, will seize on a guy like that and say, like, you do our bidding, right? It will fuck your career, but you're on the way out anyway, and presumably there will be some kind of reward for him. And they'll pick variously from Democratic or Republican senators to spike various things that are going through that they don't like. So that is what it looks like when you have a paralyzed, rubbish, dysfunctional political system. I mean, Biden's supposed to be a candidate of stability. He can't create stability. He just can't do it. And in Beijing, they must just be laughing their heads off. I mean, they just must be just laughing their heads off.
I mean, I think that to sort of dial back a bit, like on that conversation about like Chinese controls on the internet and trying to build a defense against late capitalism, whilst remaining the most important capitalist power now. Like, I think that's fair. Like, that's the direction that the world economy is going in. I mean, at least at least in trying to like create those ballasts, they are rejecting American cultural exports, which the UK has not been able to do. We just like take any old shite that comes from America and swallow it up. Like we've do you know what I mean, we've talked about that so many times on this podcast. But I think it's interesting, like this developing sense of the the kind of the decline of America, the culture war particularly, and other like European culture's reaction to those exports. So this big debate that's happening in France right now. I don't know if you followed this, but well, I mean, your wife's modern languages, isn't it? She speaks French. There's a big debate that's happening at the moment about the introduction of pronouns,
Right.
changing the pronouns in French, which I assume is similar to Spanish, where there's a
Oh, I
masculine
think
and a
masculine,
feminine.
feminine. Yeah.
Yeah. So this has become a huge debate in French society. Um, and then really at its core, it's about, I think, like the discourse of the academy, um, particularly like the American elite universities, how widespread this has become, and like how much it's impacting on. I mean, you know what the French are like.
Yeah, yeah. They're
They
very
don't want
protective of
anyone fucking with
culture.
their
Yeah.
language. I mean, the last big debate in French was about the word podcast.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what is a faction pushing to kind of remove that gendered quality from French language?
Yeah. Yeah, there is.
But I presume French wouldn't work without it.
Um, I mean, there's a few articles giving examples of what could be used instead. Do you know what I mean? Like that there's actually like a pronoun that could be used in French that didn't have a gender attached to it.
Mm.
But I mean, see, at the end of the day, do you care?
No, but it's also the weird thing is people seem to think that they can change language. You cannot manufacture a change of language that simply. Languages do change over time.
But
But
it's because they're spoken.
yeah, it's because they're
Speech
spoken
patterns.
and they organically change and move over time. But attempts to forcefully change language are notoriously weak. Like it's very difficult for some kind of centralized decision to be made, and then everyone transforms the language. Like the communicative capacity of, say, the university sector isn't that strong. It's not talking to most of the population. So it's like the stuff that people say, like there was a mood, maybe it's departing right now, I don't know, in academia to start referring to people of a Latin American heritage as Latinx, right? That's something that just came out of nowhere. Like it doesn't have any actual real roots in these communities. And like a tiny proportion of people in America use the word Latinx. They're all white.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
what you have here is that attempt to force a change in language towards what I presume they thought was a more progressive form of language. The why, I have no idea, right? But it's taken up only by the people, by its progenitors. It's taken up only by people who think it's a good idea in the first
But
place.
it's not just that they think it's a good idea. It's like this is literally the language of the elite.
Yeah.
Like, that's what this actually is. Like academic language or modifying a language to fit a type of like academic viewpoint. Like that's the behavior of the elite. Is trying to develop a language of the elite. And the problem, like this, I think that the stuff around language here like gets to the absolute crux of the culture war. That no matter which, like basically, if you are on the conservative side of the culture war, or if you're on the progressive side of the culture war, and I mean like small c conservative, like on whatever issue it might be, literally no side can win, right? The culture war is a completely unwinnable one. It's not like class war, right? Because you're actually talking about forces there. The culture war is just like two groups of people, sometimes one of which will make a symbolic victory over the other, but that actually a lot of it is quite meaningless. And the liberal ideology needs both of those sides to continue the culture war in order to reassert its dominance time and time again.
Both sides need each other. Very.
Both sides need each other, but the whole like liberal ideology needs the culture war.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like this is what it really comes down to, is that okay, so in the culture war, you kind of have these binary debates about well, it's an example, vaccinations, right? So like mandatory vaccinations, let's say, right? And this is, do you know what I mean? Like regardless of whatever your view is or my view is, like on mandatory vaccinations, there will be a group of people who say the morally right thing to do is for everyone to be mandatory vaccinated because it's the only way to be safe. More often than not, I would say this is seen as the left position. And for anyone listening, like I'm sort of doing scare quotes in the air there. And people saying, no, absolutely not. This is an infringement of liberty. That's seen as the right-wing position. Literally neither of those positions have anything to do with the ideologies of the left and the right. There's like zero, nothing.
Yeah.
to do with any of that. But like what's happening is like these are both aspects of liberal ideology. Like the culture war is not between left and right. It's not a battle between like socialism and like reactionary conservatism. It's not that.
It's between two different interpretations of the liberal hegemony. So, and this is how you get a situation where like people who are anti-vax will talk about it's George Orwell's 1984. Their claim is never, well, it's obviously not the claim that someone who is like meaningfully conservative at the start of the 20th century would have made, right? It's not the kind of claim of, no one says you're trying to give me a vaccine, but I want to remain lord of my household in a strictly hierarchical society. God didn't take a vaccine. God doesn't want this. It's the devil's work, et cetera, right? You're trying to corrupt the traditional structures of society. What you have instead is like people saying, I want to be free to do what I want with my body in society, et cetera, which is an attitude they've been taught a long time by like the liberal hegemonic ideas of our society. And another group of people, I mean, who sort of do the kind of the sort of positive liberalism thing of, well, sometimes that involves, say, a common state measure that protects us all or whatever. I mean, in a weird kind of way, the debate here and in so many other areas has never moved beyond that classic debate within liberalism between negative and positive liberty, right? So, which is like the first thing you learn in like politics class at university, that there's this, or like philosophy, that there's this debate in liberalism between positive and negative liberty. And that's the only debate we seem to be having over and over and over again. And it's a trap. And but the thing is as well is that it's traditionally, when we talk about the left and the right, both socialism and conservatism traditionally were sort of had a kind of ambivalent attitude towards that debate within liberalism. And we now ended up in a situation where there's not a distinctive socialist orientation on any of these questions because of their origin in within the liberal paradigm.
Yeah, but it's also the case that I think, particularly since the 1980s, that the left has won a number of symbolic or cultural victories when it comes to language, when it's come to gender. Do you know what I mean? There's a lot of there are some symbolic victories, But the problem is that we don't actually have any strong, organized, like working class political institutions anymore in order to fight for economic victories. Do you know what I mean? So I do feel like maybe it's not so much a failure of the left. I don't necessarily think that's what I'm trying to say. I think I'm just trying to point out that the culture war's been going on for a long time. You know, there's always been these types of debates, but I think that the factors like the internet, like the kind of the exportation of the like academic language and like the ideas of the academy into mainstream society, and the what was the third one? Yeah, basically there'd be no institutional power economically, or little institutional power economically, for securing economic victories for the vast majority of people. I think that that's what's exposed a lot of the cracks.
Yeah, and of course, in the meantime, those sort of partial symbolic victories that you talk about with the left have been incorporated deep into the kind of managerial assets and capacities of both the kind of private system and the public sphere, into public institutions and so on. And you know, we're now in a situation where it's been, you know, the decline in trade union membership in Britain is about 45 years on the trot, right? So we're talking about a very extensive period in the decline of working class institutions. And most people's vision of left-wing politics it's the famous point that Marx makes about, you know, in 18th Brumaire, of each generation sort of play acts in the clothes of the past generation. It's the only way it can think about politics. You can't imagine the future, really. All you can do is draw upon the past. And everyone does that to equip themselves with the weapons to fight today's battles. Well, people of our age and even older, we have no equipment, historical equipment to draw upon. It's no kind of recent historical memory, except for this kind of very distended idea of what's involved in a civil rights struggle, which is why so many people are desperate to arrive at one of two things. One is the concept of like formal legal equality. So when we have debates about equality now, it very rapidly becomes a debate about enshrining it in law. Well, if you look at the statute books, at least, I'm not saying this brings about equality in society, because it doesn't, right? Proving the ultimate, of course, ultimately limited nature of liberal politics. Bringing about formal equality doesn't create any kind of true equality. It can't in a class society. But if you look at the statute books, you'd be pretty hard pressed to find, with one major exception, I think, which is the distinction in legal rights between citizens and non-citizens. But if we're talking about citizens of the country, you'd be very hard pressed to find a significant legal disparity between the citizens of this country. So this constant attempt to amend legislation in a way to bring about equality it's just an attempt to rerun the past over and over. We've exhausted our arsenal of what it is that you do about the world. And I suppose a secondary one is this idea of, you know, politics is downstream from culture, so we'll change culture. Which is the only other idea that I can see on a widespread level on the contemporary left. I don't even think it's true, by the way. And this is something the right claims as well. They're trying to meddle with our culture because that'll meddle with our politics. I don't think that's true. I don't think it has that effect ultimately, right? I think anything that goes on in the cultural realm can transmute into the political realm in a completely controlled and neutered form. And that's what has happened. Like, we've ended up with a society based on substantially the same social relations as existed in 1980, but colored and repackaged in a completely new body of language. You know about inclusivity and stigma, and how to avoid stigma, and how to create a formally inclusive language to avoid it, and so on. But the outcome of that is a much more unequal society than we had 40 years ago. So yeah, I think that's a major part of the problem, is to reuse old tools to fight contemporary battles that they've been proven to be completely ineffective in, over and over and over again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't disagree with a lot of that. I mean, I suppose, yeah. So I was going to say something really boring there, and then I realized I was actually going to bore myself. So I just thought, fuck it, I'll just not say it. That's what happens when you consume too much content.
Yeah, pumped full of content.
I think
So,
I'm going to call this episode "Content Loving Sluts."
oh my God, go for it. I'm looking forward to the backlash on that, but we could just send it on to that guy with the syllabus. We could ask him to put this on the syllabus.
Yeah, could.
As part of the discussion.
I know, you'll probably, like, do you know what I mean? To get a job in academia, you'll probably have to, like, make out that you are, like, really into porn. It's the same way, like, with the internet, right? Do you remember, like, when you were in your teens, the internet was for, like, for freaks and perverts? Do you know what I mean? You would never, like, openly talk about being on MSN Messenger because people would think that you were creepy. Whereas now everyone's talking about the internet. I wonder if that's what porn will be like. It already seems to be coming like that. Like, rather than, like, porn is the sort of the thing for, creeps, and that's done, like, hidden, and all that sort of stuff. Maybe, like, people will be like, oh no, totally, just, like, sitting down for dinner and watching a wee porno.
I know, but I think that's already.
That's going to happen.
I think that's already taking place in some corners. I remember a few years ago, even I was watching that American YouTube show, The Young Turks, right? Mm-hmm. And they were talking about there were some new regulations introduced, because there's controversies now. See, this is how something gets normalized. There's controversies now about pornography because it's been found out that some of the biggest porn sites have all this illegal porn on them, right?
I for one, am shocked.
No. So there's now a debate about how you regulate the sector. So anyway, it was a segment about that, and they were like, oh, how do you safely search for porn, right? So that's then a talking point. And there was a bunch of people, in their 20s and 30s having a debate about how you ethically search for porn, right?
I really, like, we need to stop talking about this. Like, the left are like, I mean, basically we should not be talking about this, because whenever I hear socialists talk about sex or porn, I'm just like, fucking alarm bells.
I know, it's terrifying. Did I ever tell you about in Liverpool, I went into a really old, kind of well-established left-wing bookshop there, and it was like, it's quite a big bookshop, really, for a kind of left-wing retailer, and it was like 2/3 just sex patter, and I was like, what has happened? And there was, like, do you know what I mean? The area for, like, trade unionism was tiny, and then there was a tiny bit of Marx. You can imagine my outrage, right?
A sliver of Marx.
Right? And then just
mental.
Just wall-to-wall porn studies type stuff. You know what I mean? And I was like, what has happened here? I mean, I don't know. I can't help but feel, I mean, you could probably come up with a Freudian theory that coherently argues that the reason the left was, like, so powerful in the 1920s was because it was so repressed.
Yeah.
It had nothing else to do with its time but kind of organize an overthrow of, like, states that was purely just, like, displaced sexual energy.
Well, I mean, like, I think probably it was like that sort of the thing about, like, the ego being in charge. Like, the ego was in the driving seat. Like, the sense of self was really, like, in the driving seat of people's psyche. Whereas now the world is just dominated by the fucking id.
Yeah.
The internet is the id.
Yeah. The id has taken over the modern world. The internet.
The left is like the super ego coming in and giving everyone a row.
The left's politics are sort of downstream from the id. The id is pissing into the stream. Oh,
So poetic.
yeah. Can we end this on a light note?
Oh, please, please.
The elections in Chile.
Say it like you were gonna say it.
Chile.
Chile.
Or yeah, Chile.
Chile. Yeah.
Are
So this
remarkable.
is the election of Gabriel Boric. Is that how you say his name? Boric? Boric?
I think so. I think it's actually a Croatian name. But yeah, so it might be Boric or something like that. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's just so obviously it follows the 2019 movement and vote to sort of transform the country's constitution, which is still a holdover from the kind of Pinochet times. And it's also, there have been several other victories for so-called kind of pink tide movements in Latin America in the last year, and even more in the last couple of years. And it just strikes me as like incredible. I mean, in many ways, it remains like the most politically interesting part of the world system, because it still has mass successful electoral and social movement kind of left-wing forces. And it's very interesting to think about why that's been the case. What is it about its particular context that left-wing currents remain so kind of strong? I mean, the breakdown of the figures also suggests some weaknesses. So in Chile, for example, I mean, I think he got about 4 million votes for it, and the country's population is something like 19.5 million. So, and obviously he got a lot more votes than the runner-up, the kind of the pro-Pinochet type right winger. So it still implies that in those countries there's a major democratic crisis, like as there is in Europe, for example. There is a huge area of the population that doesn't engage with politics. There was an interesting article about the election on NLR's Sidecar blog, and they were talking about how Boric could have chosen to appeal to that politically detached half of the country and draw them in. And what he did was choose to sort of invite a broad tent, including sort of right-wing voters put off by the radicalism of the rights candidate, into his camp. So there are already serious contradictions in the situation, as there are in all the pink tide governments. Like, so his coalition it has people very far left in it, in the Communist Party and stuff like that. But he's in the more kind of conciliatory wing that wants to build a kind of broad, cohesive front, including kind of more liberal parts of the right and stuff like that. So I suppose we'll have to see how that all pans out. But it is at least a wee Christmas present at the end of the year. Like, it reminds you that because those people, like in Latin America, have been drowned in blood decade after decade after decade for trying to improve their societies and trying to wrench them free of the American sphere of influence, the US sphere of influence, I should probably say. And they just seem to, like, there's such an incredible resilience and refusal to be humiliated, which I just I find completely remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I lost my train of thought before I even spoke there. But like Chile is, well, I think it was at one point like the fastest growing, like economically, of all the Latin American countries. But it's also one of the most unequal. Like, I think it had some of the biggest neoliberal reforms. And it still doesn't really have like a proper like social state apparatus. Like, there's no welfare state, which I believe was Boric's main promise if he was elected, was to build a welfare state, which, I mean, it's it's not Chavez. I'm sure there will be plenty of hysteria about, the communist upstart, seizing power, the usual kind of rhetoric. But he seems like do you know what I mean? Like a social democrat.
Mm.
And that's not to take away from his victory at all. Like, I think it's a really, really good thing. Do you know what I mean? Like, and broadly speaking, socialists need examples to look to wherever they happen of gains that are made in these types of things, especially when it's someone running on like that type of universalist platform. When I think back to like Medicare for all, like how popular that was as a policy with like the actual US electorate. And there's just like when it came to the presidential race, like there was neither candidate would take on the mantle. And so I think that it's a good thing, generally speaking, to show that these types of ideas are popular and that the people who advocate for them can take power. I mean, it's the hope that kills you. I saw a picture of Gabriel Boric celebrating, and he had on a white shirt, like with no tie, open neck,
Oh
and
yeah,
like a navy blue jacket, and all I saw was Alexis Tsipras.
yeah, yeah,
Do you know what I mean? Like, and do you know what I mean? No matter, this is the thing, like about being involved in socialist politics and having like sort of bound yourself to that ideology or that set of ideas, um or however you want to frame it, but you still have like this kind of like a bit of hope. Do you know what I mean? Like when there's a victory, it's like, okay, that is, at least one step forward. um yeah.
yeah. But yeah, I mean, there's kind of an eternal quality to the fights over there. People get thrown in and out of power. But there are also, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I think sometimes people forget that the kind of Chavez example is actually quite an unusual one. In the pink tide as a whole, he was, or became when he was in office, partly because of the pressure from the right. He responded to that by radicalizing, and that's typically not what happens with left-wing governments. They back off when there's a fight. So Boric said in his speech, I mean, he was already saying things like, "We need to unify the country," right? So you can already see that the pressures of the situation are driving a certain political logic. I'm not gonna sort of second guess that situation, because there are factors in play like the mass movement that still exists from 2019 who might have other ideas about things. But yeah, you can already see there's always going to be an immense pressure for conciliation, and there's always going to be a wing of any left-wing movement which is prepared for conciliation. My own experience of that, having seen it in my lifetime, is that it's a disaster in like 100% of of occasions. But if you look at like Lula in Brazil, he's obviously of that stripe as well. I mean, by the time the Workers' Party got kicked out of power, they weren't terribly radical anymore by any kind of stretch of the imagination. That said, I obviously still hope that Lula removes Bolsonaro. But at least it's still a healthier situation in Latin America, even in those countries where the conciliatory elements are strong. It's a healthier situation than you have. I'm dreading the French presidential election, because we're right back where we were with Marine Le Pen versus Macron, except now it might be Zemmour.
Yeah, is Zemmour the one that's like more right wing than Le Pen?
He's so crazy. Like
Is that right? Is that,
yeah.
okay? I'm
One of Zemmour's policies, right, is that no one in France should have a non-French first name. The guy, by the way, that who just lost in Chile, he also had, this is a thing that goes on in the right now. I think I've talked before about these super demands you get on the left sometimes now, these kind of really ultra demands,
Mm.
The value of which I think is a bit dubious, but you get it on the right as well. So this guy was going to dig a huge trench between Chile and Bolivia to stop refugees coming in from Bolivia, right?
Oh, it's like the wall, but not.
Wall, but the trench, build that trench, right? Stupid policy, stupid idea, ridiculous. The right, this is the thing as well, like the right have totally subculturalized. They've totally lost any sense of like a constructive political project at all, even on their own terms. Now it's pure negation. Build walls and ditches,
This
right?
is the thing about like
And tell people what they
the
can call
names.
their
Yeah,
kids.
this is, do you know what I mean? Like, imagine, right? Imagine that for a second that came into force, despite the fact that it would be incredibly fucking boring, right? Like, it is a symbolic fucking victory for their side.
What's it doing for you?
Nothing.
You force parents to not call their kid Mohammed in public.
And instead, everyone's called Jack.
Aye, what have you achieved? I mean, apart from something quite miserable, I suppose the real answer is you get to humiliate someone.
Well,
That's some achievement. I mean, it's powerful stuff. And these are the same guys like Zemmour who go around talking about how they're leading the fight back for the greatness that is France or Western civilization or something. The greatness
do
of a society
you
that,
know what I mean? Is that like reactionary nostalgia?
yeah, for a time that never existed. There was never a time in
Yeah.
France where everyone had a French name. Um, so yeah, it's just, I mean, it's just at least in Chile, and in other parts of Latin America, there seem to be people having a meaningful debate on at least some level about politics. In Western Europe, I mean, and Europe as a whole, it's increasingly just completely ludicrous, just nonsense. But and it's also going to be this thing of like an ever rightward moving Macron, more and more authoritarian, more and more unpleasant, and everyone will have to rally around Macron to see off this guy who is just not on this planet. And it's just such a toxic. I mean, French politics is way to the right today of where it was 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, you
Proving,
can see that in the discussions about like the change in language and stuff. You can
yeah,
imagine how that's landing.
the proving that at most what you can achieve is, but with this kind of rally around the liberal centre argument, is uh, that you stave off the right for a couple more years at most, because there's a sense in which as well an authoritarian liberal centre, just rearms the right in so many ways.
But yeah, I mean, but we're literally seeing this in the polls in the US. Like
Yeah, of course.
everyone was like, "Oh, Trump is gone. He's finished." Blah blah blah. I mean, the polls last month were putting Trump to like beat Biden on like every count.
You would need to ask yourself, right? Would it have been better for Trump to squeak through into a second term with a divided House of Representatives, etc., with all the weaknesses of going into your second of your 2 4-year terms, right? Or to have him go away for 4 years, spread a shit ton of conspiracy theories all over the place, re-emerge with an even larger movement and more radicalized in 4 years' time after a 4-year-long demonstration of how shit the Democrats are.
Mm.
Which one of these outcomes is actually better or worse? I'm not sure.
I know. I think it's hard, but like that's partly because the Democrats in that position were always like, I mean, Biden was never going to be able to deliver what he said he would deliver on a number of things. Do you know what I mean? Like even like the kind of the things that were made like moral prerogatives, like all the kids in cages stuff, like children at the border, like detained asylum seekers, all of that. Like his approval rating with young people is in the toilet.
Mm-hmm.
And the Democrats like always rely on that vote.
Yeah. So
I mean, Kamala's are worse.
Yeah, no, I always assumed that it was Biden was going to be a stepping stone for Kamala, but
Yeah. He seems to be holding on, eh? Still going.
yeah, I think he is becoming more incoherent, but no, he still seems to be going. Um, but yeah, so that'll be another interesting the
Yeah,
midterm
let's keep it on the happy note of Chile.
yeah, Chile. So yeah, no, but a good way to end the year there. Little bit of hope, little bit of season's hope.
Beautiful. Well, we hope everyone has a lovely Christmas and a nice new year. If you get the chance, please go and check out our new Contour website. It's had a bit of a facelift. And you can also get extra Contourcast content and lots of other things if you sign up to our Patreon. And all the information about that's available on the website. That's me done my sales pitch.
Cheers.
Bye.